Good afternoon. Thank you for joining EWA for this webinar. Get ready for the new abnormal. What will school look like next fall? I'm Eric Roblin, EWA's Deputy Director. Before we begin, let me go over some quick housekeeping items. Number one, if you have a question for our speakers, type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Include your name and affiliation. You can post a question at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. And now to the webinar content. Schools around the country will eventually reopen, and when they do, things are likely to look a lot different, at least for the next year or so. I'm not talking about spellbinding innovations inspired by remote learning. We're talking nuts and bolts, very practical stuff. Two key factors stand out. Number one, some form of physical distancing will likely still be required, even if it's less rigid than right now. And that's sure to have big implications for how schools operate and the experience for students and educators. Two, millions of students have lost weeks of learning time. Yes, many systems have pivoted to remote learning, but so far it seems that this is simply no substitute. And I can tell you this is certainly the case for my son, who's a sixth grader. Today, we're joined by two education leaders to help make sense of the situation and the many important decisions ahead that will shape how school might look different this fall. We have Stephen Pruitt, who is the president of the Southern Regional Education Board. He's a former state chief in Kentucky and is co-chairing a 16-state education recovery task force that was just launched. We also have Dr. Sonia Santelises, a veteran educator and currently the CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools. With that, Stephen will start, followed by Sonia. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Eric. Appreciate the opportunity to come and be with you guys today. If you could call up my slides here, I promise you they're not going to be a long presentation, but it just helps keep me on track. I'll start in case you're not familiar with the Southern Regional Education Board, or as we call it, SREB. We are an interstate compact that was formed back in 1948 when the Roosevelt Commission determined that the South was the biggest economic liability in the country. So our 16 governors and legislatures came together and basically created us. I like to say that it's just like when you build a bridge over a body of water. Both states have to enter into an agreement to maintain the bridge, and we're sort of a metaphorical bridge across the 16 states. We go from Delaware down to Florida, over to Texas, and up through Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kentucky. So we have been for a long time focused on helping our states, convening our states to talk about different issues around education and helping move them toward really a better economic viability. If you could advance the slide. So for us, one of the things that we've been doing during this time is, and I apologize if I get a little bit faded at times, I have two teachers inside the house teaching and a college student learning, and so my office has become our patio. And if the sun comes out behind a cloud, I seem to fade a little bit. But we have been working with our state chiefs in K-12 and also our state higher ed executives. Every other Friday, we have a conversation with them about their needs and allow them to share. And what came out of that was we really need to have a regional support and a regional way to consider reopening these schools. It was important to operate in silos or in vacuums, and that we actually brought them together to have these conversations. So we launched last week, or announced last week, that we would have a regional K-12 education recovery task force. That's going to be state school chiefs and their appointees. And today, actually earlier today, we announced a regional higher education recovery task force that will focus on the recovery for post-secondary, both 2-year, 4-year, community, technical colleges as they consider their reopening. If you advance. So what are we going to talk about? Well, I want to be clear up front. We're not going to talk about how. We're not going to talk about when, because when is just something that is better left to the health specialists, to governors, we're not going to worry about the when, but we are going to really focus on how. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of what are the things that we need to think about at the state level, the district level, and schools. So some things to consider here. How will states and districts and schools accelerate learning for students who are already behind academically? We know that remediation, in the sense that many people think about remediation, doesn't really work well. It's actually, we need to think about how we're going to accelerate them. How can states and schools better prepare for COVID-19 resurgence or other emergencies? This past week, over Easter holidays, or Easter weekend rather, we had some pretty major storms that came through the South. In fact, we had in Tennessee one entire elementary school that was destroyed by a tornado. So whether COVID-19 has a resurgence or whether or not we have some other type of catastrophe, we want to have some type of playbook that's going to help people walk through how to manage the closings. How can state schools provide students for social emotional health? Our students have gone through so much. There's going to be a lot of trauma, a lot of fear. And so the task force is going to be, that's going to be one of the issues that we'll tackle. Next slide. Budget's going to be a big deal. How we manage fiscally. The shortfalls are going to be something that is going to be massive, I think, across the South. But how will those current budget shortfalls impact schools, and especially focused on the most disadvantaged students? How can we ensure that we are providing an equitable education for every child? How can states resources for pre-K-12 schools and higher education once the immediate crisis subsides? How can we really manage that? And then, of course, what inequities among students were present before and which ones were exacerbated during the pandemic? Again, those are, we have to go into this with our minds wide open. What we are seeing is that, and what we're saying is, we can't go into the fall whenever these schools open up again and hope everything goes okay, because hope is not a strategy. We have to recognize that there's going to be deficiencies. We have to recognize that there's going to be areas where we have to really focus. I think that we're going to be in a place where we have to actually diagnose far more than we ever have before to just ensure that we can actually provide quality education. There's all sorts of conversations that are going on out there right now about all of these kinds of issues. You can advance the slide. But everything from how we approach this from a logistics standpoint, we're hearing people say, oh, we're going to do modified schedules. What does that really mean? And is there really anything that can help with that? If you go to a schedule that we've heard some people say, we're going to do half the kids in the morning, half the kids in the afternoon. Well, you're doubling your bus routes. That's going to be a pretty significant change in your budget, not to mention the logistics, and we already see a massive bus driver shortage around the South. So how can we, some things that you might want to consider as you're doing your work. How can your state avoid setbacks in raising education attainment of its citizens? How will potential lags in education progress affect your state's current and future workforce? What kinds of new support do educators need? Professional development, online learning, emotional health. And then I'm going to end it with this, so you can go to the last slide. The last slide, what I'll end with and then turn it over to Sonia is, some of you may even be familiar with the work that we've done around the workforce and how we have done a big report called Unprepared and Unaware that in 2030, we're going to see a pretty significant shift in our workforce. Well, the thing is 2030 used to be on the horizon, and now it's pretty much the next exit. And we're going to need to be prepared. So my hope is that our schools around the South and around the country take this as not just as the challenge to deal with an incredibly unprecedented event, but also the opportunity to make some clear pivots to how we can really support our students K-12 and then ultimately in post-secondary. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sonia. Yeah, Eric first. I'm not sure which one.
Thank you, Stephen. This is a helpful overview. Sonia, again, Sonia Santelises, she's the CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools, and you'll say just a little bit about what's happening now for students and families, and then what's on the horizon. How is it going to be different in the fall?
Sure. Well, thank you. It's always good to be with EWA, and just want to thank the large numbers of folks on the phone who have given great visibility into education during the last month or so of this crisis. It actually really does help. So thank you for that. But just in terms of what's going on the ground, and again, some of it varies from community to community, but as I talk to colleagues both across the South and across the country, some of the things we're seeing on the ground here in Baltimore are replicated across the country. So, first, we are now into probably our second second and a half official week of distance learning with technology. And so what we're experiencing there, and I just got off a phone call with Senator Van Hollen and some of my other colleagues talking about, this term, the digital divide, and what that looks like on the ground when I'm talking to principals and teachers. Is one, a medium that not everyone has access to. So we know that there are still issues of connectivity. There are still issues of device to student. In Baltimore City, pre-COVID-19, we had a one device for every 4 student ratio. We have done some ordering in between times. So we've ordered about 12,000 Chromebooks. But as I've said to my board and to the community, you're not going to leap a 1-to-4 ratio overnight, and certainly not in a pandemic. What we also see is that even in school districts and frankly universities that have the technology, the familiarity with the tool is also something that educators have had to ramp up proficiency with, and frankly familiarity with, in a short period of time. We have benefited in Baltimore City, I think, with the fact that we have large numbers of teachers helping other teachers. We have been working hand in hand with some of our union partners on how we actually make sure that the communication flow is actually flowing, but it's also meant a lot of flexibility. So one of our teachers of the year knows that she only can contact, a large number of her students she connects with through Instagram. And so there really is still, with all the focus on devices and connectivity, which is absolutely there, we're still seeing this great push to make sure that we're connecting with students. That's been a priority for us. That's been a priority with a number of my colleagues across the country. And so we have actual school-based targets for that. So anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week. The goal is that students get some kind of touch point from the school, from an educator / adult within the school system. Even with that, Stephen referenced the social and emotional needs of young people, whether they're adolescents, whether they're elementary school kids, in large numbers of communities, both rural and urban and suburban. We know that we have kids in crisis generally. And I was reminded of a figure last night that in Baltimore City, 20% of all child abuse cases are reported through schools. That number has plummeted in the last few weeks simply because you don't have that face-to-face contact. I've spoken with principals who have told me they are keeping even closer watch on young students who they know are in those precarious situations. But at the same time, the level of, I would say, gratitude and just openness that we've heard from families in those attempts has been overwhelming. And it's probably one of the first times where our ratio of thank yous has been much greater than that of complaints. And we still have a long way to go, but I think the community is banding together around that. Similar, there's been a lot of there were a good number of stories this weekend. One from a reporter that hails from Baltimore City around the school feeding, and that is real. It is real when you are on the ground, watching parents, watching families, even with all the social distancing guidelines, brave, at one of our sites, John Rora, a line that went around the block, and people stood in line for close to, and we had volunteers, close to 40 minutes to an hour to get a pack of Pampers and a bag of non-perishables. That is not a minor support. And, you know, anybody who knows me knows I'm academics, you know, I have a laser focus on academics, but you can't serve children and families and ignore the very palpable everyday need of making sure people don't go hungry and making sure they have access to that. I think as we look forward, and this will, I'll kind of transition into looking forward. And let me just be clear, I am on phone calls and video chats with colleagues across the country, and I am just as informed of their work as I am on what's going on in Baltimore City. But what many of us are finding, even those of us who found creative ideas like, you know, for example, in Baltimore City with our curriculum partners, we actually broadcast lessons K through 8 every day for math and ELA, just as another way for families to be connected in addition to the internet. But one of the things that we're already asking ourselves, as Stephen said, in a very practical way, is while we are doing yeoman's work to make sure kids are connected and that there's some continuity of learning, we know young people are going to enter at very different places. So I actually have a conversation tomorrow with one of our formative assessment partners to really get a handle on what we knew about our young people when they left on a couple, you know, on some of our key measures, and how do we use that to organize and differentiate instruction, which is frankly difficult on a regular day, and that we have to know how to do at scale, and we were working on that now is even more challenging. Stephen referenced rotating openings. I was looking at the story, and forgive me for not remembering who did that story, but the story on Denmark, right? And we're watching that. And, you know, the first thing my chief operating officer said to me, yeah, do you know what that's going to look like if we try to keep, you know, all of the students 6 feet apart in one of our elementary schools, Commodore John Rogers, K-8 schools that has 32 kids to a class, right? What is that going to look like in already space challenged settings? Even in terms of safety, right? So do we begin ordering PPE for teachers and students? What does that look like? Is that a cost we'll assume, or do we assume someone else will assume that cost? And then, as someone said, just the connections that young people are missing with adults. For all of the, you know, improvement we absolutely have to do in schools. And it's, you know, one of the things that's disheartening is in Baltimore City, we had done a lot of work over the last couple of years around things like reading and math and increasing content exposure to science and social studies and real life experiences. The reality is when young people return, they will need time to adjust to what this frankly, emergency has meant to them. And the example I use on that, and I'll close, is that one of my own daughters, so I have 3, like Stephen, we've got folks, you know, posted around my house right now. And I will tell you, my highest performing, like 1%er daughter, the one that everybody would think would be doing fine, slipped a note under my door a week ago during a webinar and wrote a very prolific 2-paragraph short note to her dad and I and said, Mommy and Daddy, I just need you to know this is really hard. And I don't like technology. It makes me feel stupid. I just want to either go back to school or I want you to really homeschool me. And this makes me hate COVID-19 even more because school shouldn't be like this, right? And so I'm holding that as a mom. I'm holding that as the head of a school system and saying that regardless of where our students were academically, and we are, again, working with our curriculum and our assessment partners to get that in place, we are going to not be able to leapfrog over preparing teachers, principals to process this experience with kids in whatever the new iteration of schooling looks like. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Eric.
Thank you so much to both of you. Those are great overviews, and Sonia, so helpful to hear more about the on-the-ground experience that you have. I'm curious about, and I'll ask you first, and then also Stephen. I mean, how serious do we think it is that the reality may be that schools just cannot operate at full capacity during the school day? Is that likely to be the reality? And if yes, you know, what are sort of the options on the table of what that could look like?
So, I would say that's not my call. I defer to, Stephen as the former state chief. He knows how those calls get made. And in our state, the state chief makes the call. But I will say, from a local proactive level, those are the scenarios we're running, Eric. So we have said, what happens if we do have to alternate days, or as Stephen was referencing earlier, what does it mean to say half day when you already have an overtaxed transportation system, and in the case of Baltimore, an anemic at best public transportation system. So part of what we've been thinking of already is what are some of the structures that in and of themselves are not going to ensure children have a better education. And we're very clear about that. But what does it mean, for example, to get an increased number of our schools? We have a small number now who have an extended year already. And those schools actually, it's part of why they have permission to do it, are doing a great job with extended year. Is this the time to roll that out to more schools and use those schools as models for how to make the most of that extra time? Does it mean adding an hour to the school day, particularly in elementary or middle, where there's less interference in after school activities and sports and things like that? But again, I've been in this business, unfortunately, a long time. And I remember when we just added time to the day and didn't change the day, and nothing changed for what young people experience. So yes, that's a long-winded way of saying, Eric, we are absolutely planning for a variety of scenarios, on off, early start, mid-year release in case there's another outbreak and we have to decrease. As one of my cabinet members said to me, normally, Sonia, we generate 2 to 3 scenarios. We're now up to 8. And so we feel like, right now, well, hopefully whittle that down. But I've called this education's Apollo 13 moment, right? What do you have on the table, and how do you use what you have on the table and think differently about it in a way that is very child-centered?
Okay, thank you. Stephen, before you respond, I just want to give a couple of things for our audience. I believe, Sonia, you made 2 references to news stories at least. One of them, the Denmark story, which I read too. This is from the New York Times. It was a piece about how schools in Denmark are reopening now and how it's different and spaced apart, desks, I think, 6 feet apart. And the other, I believe, was a reference to Erica Green's excellent New York Times story. Erica is also an EWA board member, so, and of course worked at the Baltimore Sun for many years. So just if folks are interested in that, you can find those stories. But Stephen, can you talk about, like, what would the practical school experience be like if it's half capacity or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'd like to start with, and Sonia did a great job of really laying all that out. I really like the Apollo 13 moment too, by the way. I'll cite you, of course, but I may take it. The thing is, since all of this started, really everybody went into triage mode. They went into trying to figure out, what am I going to do the next minute, the next hour, and eventually they got to the next day. And now I think that they're, inappropriately so, people are starting to think about what's going to happen when. But it's also really hard because you have a lot of different people, a lot of different, I've since we announced the task force, I've been getting emails from people I haven't heard from in a decade who have a great idea, you know, and that's good. We need all the ideas, but I think that what we're going to have to think about as we get ready to reopen these schools is right now there are more questions than answers. Right now there are things that sound really good if you just look at that one thing. But as I like to say all the time, education is not rocket science, because rocket science is actually easier. You know, you can predict when things blow up. You can predict, trajectories. You can predict orbits. Not so much when you're dealing with humans and you're dealing with people who have different ideas, because there's no resource base for this. There's no best practice that we can point to and say, oh, well, after you've been out of school for 19 weeks, here's what you should do. So I think that when we get ready to come back, when we get ready for schools to really reopen, there's going to have to be a really good, long conversation, and that's why we really started this task force, into thinking about how do we, let's identify what all the questions are first, and then what might be different scenarios that schools would do. Because everything's not going to work. You know, what works for Sonia in Baltimore is not going to work for, say, Twiggs County, Georgia. You know, very different area. You got a very rural area versus an urban area. So what we're thinking about is this new abnormal is we've got to put a lot of things on the table. And again, this is why I think I love your analogy of Apollo 13. That scene where they dump all the stuff on the table and say, we've got to make this round filter fit in this square hole using just this. And that's really where schools are right now. We're going to have to look at all of this stuff and see, is there any research base for any of this? You know, because there's a lot of people who have great ideas, but and we're going to have to probably go with opinion on some of this, but or at least, you know, educational experience. But we also need to try to be really careful that we don't do something that's going to create a bigger problem. You know, we don't create what I call a kudzu moment. We make an immediate decision that sounds really good at the time, like we did with kudzu to stop erosion, then all of a sudden it took over everything and really caused a problem. And so we really kind of have to approach this from a systemic standpoint.
Here's a question. Very practical, a little touchy, I'm sure, and I'm sure you're deeply worried about this, Sonia, in Baltimore, and Stephen, I'm sure many states are. Is there a real reality that systems maybe is needing to lay off staff and actually have a smaller teacher workforce? Is that something? Obviously, there's the big question about whether the feds will step up with still more stimulus money to avert that. But is that a potential scenario?
So I will just say so we've been fortunate in Maryland thus far, and I say thus far, right, where that, you know, we know that it's coming in some form, but it's not nearly as direct or severe as some colleagues. I have colleagues throughout the country who already know their current budget, meaning for this upcoming school year, is going to be cut by 15 to 20%, which is unheard of in a large school district, or even a small one, quite frankly. I have colleagues here, to Stephen's point, in rural districts in Maryland, and that would decimate them as well. So everything is on the table. We are doing, you know, we are watching very closely the finances, very closely the aid. I think this first round, what helped was the flexibility. So for example, we spent $4 million on additional Chromebooks that we took from a variety of places, not knowing how we were going to fill it. And the CARES Act, at least as it's currently written, you know, and gone forth, would help us pay for some of that, our overtime for some of our food service workers. But I do know, based on, like I said, conversations with colleagues across the country, many have already been told by local officials, start planning for the reductions, because they're real and they're present. So we are, and I think Stephen raised that issue earlier. I'm not naive in thinking that, you know, just because it's not immediate in the state of Maryland, that it won't be something that we have to confront as well. So it's real.
And I would just say, I just quickly add that, right now, I don't think that's been a big topic of conversation as far as reductions in force, but I think it's in the back of everyone's mind because in the Great Recession, we did see maybe not great layoffs, but we did see furloughs. We did see other ways of cutting down on expenses. And it took a long time to recover from that. So I think it's in the back of everybody's mind, but at this point, I don't, or at least I've not heard from chiefs and from other superintendents like Sonia that's certainly it's nothing anybody wants to do. But I think it's something that, is in the back of people's minds that this could happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one or two more questions and then start getting some questions from our audience. We're seeing a few of those roll in. And again, you can go into our system and type in your question, and we'll get to as many as we can. One question I was kind of curious about, Sonia, is this notion of, thinking about so many kids who at least maybe a quarter of the school year has been lost. Is there so what happens in the fall? I know there's going to be a lot of efforts to try to catch kids up. Is there such a thing as going to grade 6.5 or grade 7.75? Or are kids, will they start, how will you kind of orient, are you now a 6th grader or a 7th grader? Or are you just going to really catch them all up? Is that an issue that you're thinking about? I'm sorry, we don't hear you right now. Did you mute?
I did. I was trying to cut out background noise and forgot. Thank you. Yes, I mean, we are looking, though, through the frame of how do we accelerate. In Baltimore City, we are not going to be keeping kids back because of a COVID quarter. We're not doing that. Now, I can't speak for every superintendent across the country, but I can speak for Baltimore City, and we're not doing that. I'm not holding kids back. We know what the research says on that. We know that it doesn't work when kids get held back. What we are doing is accelerating some of the work we had already begun around what does enrichment look like, what does targeted skill building of missing skills when we identify places where young people frankly have severe learning gaps. And so we had been doing that work anyway. What this time period presents us with is the need, the impetus, the push to really ramp that up, which is part of why I referenced earlier. We're meeting with some of our assessment partners to see where within the core standards more deliberately kids are behind. In some of our more successful middle schools that actually do accelerate learning, where they have young people who come in 2 to 3 years behind and are accelerating them during their time in middle school. Those are things we were kind of not casually, but we were taking our time looking at. That now, with the suspension of state assessments for this school year, I've charged our assessment team with taking that time and really delving into some of that work. And then we'll be working, as I said earlier, with our curriculum partners to say, okay, how do we navigate the curriculum, which we deliberately identified in reading and math because it was content rich, because it was rigorous, and it actually was standards aligned. How do we identify some of the core skills that are within that, and then see where kids are missing and match that? We've also had discussions about how do we consider this question, and to Stephen's point, not to get so out there with it that we can't do it, but really asking ourselves the questions of how do we get the children who are furthest behind with the largest gaps in front of, for lack of a better term, the teachers who we know from the data have the greatest skill in moving kids who are behind. And we know who some of those are. We don't know who all of them are, but we know who some of them are. And does this work with technology give us an additional lever that we didn't have previously to accelerate kids by giving them more exposure, not less? And our schools that are more successful with that are schools that have figured out how to maximize and add that kind of targeted time, not those that just simply say to kids, repeat a grade. We're not doing that. So.
Okay. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to go to some other questions. Even if you feel like you really want to address that one, maybe you can circle back. But here's one from Catherine Gewertz at Education Week, who asks, and Stephen, maybe you want to take a stab at this first, to share any examples of districts around the country that are wading into assessments to figure out what students are actually learning right now during this period when they're, learning remotely or whatever the experience is.
Well, a lot of them are in the current moment. To be perfectly honest, I think that they're leaving a lot to the school level. They have access to various formative assessment tools, but I think it's also becoming a challenge because even in pretty affluent districts, sometimes you still have problems with being able to get online. Sometimes you have to wait in line to get to the computer at home because you have maybe one computer. I think the bigger issue is going to be how they use those formative assessment tools in the fall as diagnostic tools. The formative assessment is going to be critical, probably more critical than any time in history, because as much as we have a need to support our most underserved students from around the country and around the South, we actually have, for the first time, we're going to have deficits everywhere. I mean, every child has been affected by this, even our high flyers. So we're going to need to figure out a way to shift from a traditional assessment mindset into a more diagnostic one, at least at the beginning of the year, because, and Sonia kind of hit on this earlier too, traditional remediation efforts, the research shows they really don't work very well. It's actually about accelerating the learning. And part of the way you do that is you have to know where they are. So you have to diagnose them, you have to meet them where they are, and then design an instructional program that moves them forward. We can't think we're going into August and doing things as we always have. We are simply going to have to realize that we're going to spend a significant amount of time diagnosing where these kids are and then changing the instruction to match that and then to bring them forward. Because, the last thing we need is to keep telling kids they're in a deficit, or to keep telling kids, oh, well, you don't know as much. We need to flip the script on that a little bit and say, we're going to meet you where you are. We're going to give you a personalized learning plan and move you forward. So I think the people are still using them now, but I think the more than anything, the formative assessment mindset is and should move to more diagnostic thinking for when we come back into the classrooms.
Okay, thank you. We have a question that kind of picks up on this very issue from Neil Morton at the Hechinger report, previously used with the Seattle Times. Are there good models of remedial education if schools are in a position where large numbers of students will need to catch up after an extended period of lost instruction?
So, I mean, on our side, I would say that I've seen some pretty good things. At the end of the day, it's like most things in education. It boils down to the teacher. A program is usually words on a paper or something on a screen. It's really how it gets used and how it gets leveraged. At SREB, we do a large amount of training around math and English remediation to prepare kids to be college and career ready. And what we find is we like our materials, but at the end of the day, it really is just how they get implemented. A tool is a tool unless there's a human that really takes that and does something special with it. Sonia, do you want to?
Well, I was being your agreement chorus here on the side. I do think that there are schools and there are places where I think, to Stephen's point, they have figured out how to make sure that, the curriculum, the tools that are being used are sound and rigorous. But I think it's also about the deliberate matching of educator to student. And one of the things that, Ed Trust found when I was there and that others have verified is it's actually the variation in teaching skill that has the greater the greater impact within schools, right? So people look from school to school as being kind of a great shift when actually it's the segregation of quality teaching within schools that is one of the biggest leverage points. And so, that's why I think you hear Stephen saying, which I would reiterate, a lot of it comes down to the supports that we give teachers in improving their craft.
Mhm.
And being able, frankly, to take this new deluge of young people coming in who have experienced this. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
That's okay. Sonia, a follow-up question is, I read a piece, I think actually it was in a piece in the Hechinger report about where they were citing a few experts who were kind of brainstorming about different approaches for the fall. One interesting idea I recall was this notion of having the same teacher reconnect and maybe for at least part of the next school year, stay with their same class. Obviously that would be an elementary, middle and high school, that might get even more complicated, but is that something that you might be thinking about, or how does that resonate for you?
Yeah, I mean, and what I would say on that is I think some of our best ideas are actually going to come from our school leaders around that, because that idea that you described, Eric, I can picture in my mind principals who I think can pull that off, who have the rapport with their staff, who already had an incredibly strong and vibrant learning culture, who I think that would match perfectly. There are others, I'm not sure, around the implementation. They might need support, but it is that kind of idea that we're actually really going to be listening to some of our leaders, our school leaders, because that is the kind of idea that when I talk to principals, they are kind of mulling about in their thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned earlier, and I'm sure this is going to be a big issue too, Sonia, about the social and emotional dimensions of supporting children when they come back to school. And even right now, I mean, number one, are there things that your system is trying to do now to support them, and then into the fall? And Stephen, too, if you want to share some reflections on that.
Sure. So we, again, we have been sharing our ideas and taking from other places, but we really have mobilized our school social workers and those who have really strong relationships with students already to do a lot of phone checks, to do a lot of video conferencing, again, identifying which young people are more dependent on school for their mental health services, and how do we reconnect them to those city resources at a time when young people were used to coming to school to get a lot of those. We also, our student wholeness team has been really thoughtful about, within each of our televised lessons and supports for teachers, and even in the written packets, trying to include some of those social emotional checkpoints for families who are at home working with their students. So even though it might, be a story that young people are going through, making sure that there are those kind of wellness checkpoints, even while young people are at home. The other piece I do want to emphasize here is that this is a great place where we in Baltimore are leveraging some of the community partnerships. So, for example, when we can't, quote, find kids, right? The kids who, that I think it was the LA Times wrote about first. And I will say thank you to whoever that reporter was, because that came out while we were still officially on spring break. And I circulated it to my cabinet and I said, take a look over here, folks. This is happening in LA. We've got to get on this now. And it was one of the things that really drove for us this need to partner with the city, with other organizations who sometimes, frankly, have greater visibility into, quote, where our kids are than we might in traditional school. And so that partnering has helped us connect with young people that we might have been more vulnerable in losing, for lack of a better term, during this time period.
Thanks. Stephen, did you want to chime in anything on that?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. I will just say very quickly, we are, I've been guilty as much as anybody over the years of talking a lot about college and career readiness and academics and pushing toward those high marks. But having experienced some of the things I did as a school chief in Kentucky, uh, in particular around our school shooting when I was there, it sort of has changed my perspective on a lot of things. And one of them is the quadratic equation and balancing equations, chemical equations are great, but we've got to realize that that's not the motivator for a lot of our kids. This experience has been incredibly traumatizing for a lot of our students, a lot of our families, even a lot of our staffs and teachers. So I think if we go into this and we go into the fall and we don't have as one of our #1 priorities that we have taken some real strategic moves to support our kids in social and emotional welfare, catching them up is just not going to happen. We've got to make sure that that's equally as important as academics.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, there's sort of this, the social emotional, that kind of concept. There's also just the very basic socializing component that is absent for so many kids right now, except through a computer, or maybe, my son kicks a soccer ball from his side of the street to the other side of the street with the neighbor's kid. They don't touch the ball.
Yeah.
But I, again, getting back to sort of the practicalities of that, are things like, school band or school sports, is that going to have to look different with physical distancing requirements? Are people talking about that stuff too? Because so many of those activities are so a lifeline for kids. It really connects them to each other, the social glue, the community impact and importance of schools.
I think all that's on the table. I mean, the thing, and I think this is part of what's hard about this, is those are all very valid issues and concerns. The problem is we don't know where we'll be come August or September. If this thing's run its course, then, Friday Night Lights come on and all is good. If not, then needs to be a plan for it and how that's going to be managed. And so, obviously, Sonia, you're a lot closer to it than I am, but I know that for the people I'm speaking to, and when it comes to the task force, that's actually an issue that has come up, is we need to make sure that all the facets of school life have been looked at, not just how well kids are reading, but actually it's the complexity of the school organism. It's incredibly complex.
No, it really is, Stephen, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, those are the things that make school for a large number of kids and families. And what was really could be disheartening, but you're always on the move. But it is that Baltimore actually spent the last 3 years really building a lot of those things back up. So really expanding sports to the lower grades, really pushing that, pushing major expansion of the arts, so that all kids had access to having a school play or a school musical. And, for us, I'm not ceding that ground. Like, I'm not just going to say, oh, isn't that too bad that, this virus swept through and then all of that was washed down the river. If we believed that those kinds of experiences were important for the development of young people before, then the virus has not changed that. It's if anything, it's more true. So yes, so we have been watching, my athletic director has been watching about, okay, what does it mean when you watch professional sports and they're talking about playing games without the night lights, right? Like what does that actually look like, if we can at least provide some continuity to kids? So we actually are looking at that a little bit, but we just know that we're going to have to figure out a way to include those, because I think it's true for all kids, but particularly for our kids, it's actually increasing their exposure and experiences, not now taking them all away.
Here's a question. Are districts discussing strategies for childcare if they move to a half-day schedule? This came from Samantha Dowdy at the Victoria Advocate newspaper.
Well, thank you. No, Samantha, I will tell you, we had a principal who prior to this was really pushing on increased daycare options, at least for school faculty, school staff. And I chuckled when I heard the question because, we have thought about, okay, what does this mean for our teachers and educators, and do we need to think more creatively? That's a childcare setting that was set up to partner with 3 or 4 schools, so faculty members could actually bring their children, their young children, and have daycare. So at least that's the frame I enter that from. I think the state, and Stephen could talk about this, I know in Maryland, the state also oversees daycare, and that has been, a fairly challenging issue for Dr. Salmon, who really has, I think, in Maryland, pushed hard to make sure that there's daycare for first responders. So I don't know fully which public Samantha was referencing, but I would just add that.
By the way, Stephen, I'll ask you if you want to respond. One piece of this that I hadn't realized until recently is that the vast majority of Head Start centers around the country are closed. And apparently there are federal restrictions that make it difficult for those to be used for emergency care or for emergency workers' families because of the way, who is allowed to participate. We actually have a blog post coming up on this shortly, that's an issue that hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but there's, I think something like 18 or 19,000 Head Start centers out of about 2021 in total that are currently not operating. And there are some very practical, legal, statutory reasons that may be getting in the way of being able to use those for emergency workers and their families.
Well, and I'll just say that I think that's a huge issue too, because I mean, for us, even at SREB, part of my decision making is I have parents who have children who, they have nowhere else to go. So I think certainly when we come back to school, I think that's going to be a big deal. But I also want to point out that even when we talk about school starting early or utilizing summer school, one of the big things is, normal summer camps and so forth like that aren't open either. So when you have non-school age children who might normally go to daycare or go to a summer camp or whatever, so the teachers can go teach. I mean, it actually is going to create even another level of complexity.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one last question. Can you share how high schools are addressing the needs of juniors and seniors who are wondering what to do next? Is there an organized strategy or how are they looking at that? Sonia, what's happening in your system?
So in Baltimore City, we actually just put out through social media we have a particular guidebook for seniors in particular that's just geared towards answering their questions about how do we move forward, what does this mean for graduation, that we've been getting out. With regards to juniors, our college and career office really has been working overtime like everybody else, I'm sure, but really working overtime to make sure that high schools have the communication with their juniors. And we've been pushing. Our most successful principals with this to date have been those who've taken a real individualized approach to the junior class, to making sure that those touch point meetings aren't just, how's your lesson going, but it is, what does your coursework look like for next year? We have a lot of first generation college goers. So we partner with College Bound, and they have been checking in because we know that population is very vulnerable, who, were already thinking college was going to be a stretch. And so we've put some targeted resources into making sure that our juniors and seniors get a different level, quite frankly, of wraparound, because we know how easily they can fall off from either a career or a college track.
Stephen, do you want to share any last thoughts on that?
I think Sonia answered that one pretty well. I think it's certainly one of those things that we really hate, because kids should be really excited and celebrating going into their senior years. I think we should, but again, it gets back to the social and emotional well-being of these kids. We should not diminish it. We should actually find a way to help them celebrate it, but obviously it won't be in the traditional way, at least for now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to thank our guests again, Stephen Pruitt of the Southern Regional Education Board and Sonia Santelises, the Baltimore City Public Schools. As soon as the webinar closes, those who are watching, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve. Also, finally, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for our upcoming online events. We have a number of webinars in the works in coming weeks. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, Eric.